building an indie business in the center of venture capital. I am Alex Edmonds, known as SupremeRumHam on the internet, and this is the Building an Indie Business podcast. Alright, hello to all my listeners in France. This podcast episode will be about random tips, and this is all the things I've accumulated in my mind that don't really necessarily fit into one episode. So this is that episode that they all fit into now. Okay, first I wanted to talk about my book. My book, What's the Deal with Podcasting? It's a collection of all the episodes I've done on the podcast. Not all the episodes, but a lot of the podcasting episodes, I would say. And there's still some left that I have to do. The link to the book will be in the show notes. You can get it for free. Just put the discount code BAIB and you can get it for free. You don't have to put a credit card in. Okay, so let's get into the episode. Alright, so the first tip I have is better equipment does not make better content. People don't really care about the very specific aspects of your sound quality. If people can hear what you're saying, you're fine. What people are listening to your podcast for is the content. So you're better off focusing on the content quality instead of the sound quality. Okay. Have fun. Remember, podcasting is very fun. I really enjoy my podcast. It's one of the best things I do all week. And you have to keep that in mind. Have fun. Don't take it so seriously. Just relax. Chill out, bro. Remember to have fun. Okay. My next tip is pace yourself. You don't want to burn out on podcasting and making episodes. So what I would suggest is to pace yourself. Don't do 5 episodes in one day. You'll get burned out eventually. Do like 1, maybe 2 a week. And that way you pace yourself and you won't burn out so quickly and just have an RSS feed that's empty with only 6 episodes. Okay. The next thing I thought of is don't put your name in the title of the podcast. The reason why is because that doesn't really do anything for you if you're not famous somehow or people don't know you. When you have a well-known brand, that's when you should put the title and your name in the title. And since no one really knows you, you have to use SEO to grow your podcast. So instead of putting your name, put in keywords of your podcast subject, and then more people will find your podcast. Then, after 4 to 5 years, you can add your name to the title. Okay. Speaking of the title, you don't need to put the word podcast in your title. It's redundant. So if I were to put podcast in my title, I would have to say I host the Building an Indie Business podcast. It's redundant. You can just tell people, hey, it's a podcast. Or you can just put podcast at the end of the title, like I do. I say the Building an Indie Business podcast. But podcast isn't in the title. I'm just letting people know that, hey, I have a podcast. Okay. Create a pre-recording ritual. So, like in the early days of this podcast, I got really nervous. I used to get really nervous recording and live streaming the podcast. Then I created my own ritual for podcasting, a podcasting ritual, and that helped me relax and get in the zone for podcasting. So I drink water, I eat some food, I sit down, and then that puts me in the mindset for podcasting. and I don't get so nervous when I am speaking on the mic. Okay, so the next thing, the next tip I have, let's say, is protect your throat. And what I mean by this is make sure it's covered when you're out. Don't abuse your throat when you're not podcasting. Don't go yelling. Don't go to a bar and start yelling at people. When you have a sporting event, don't yell at that sporting event too much, because when you're a podcaster, your throat and your voice are your most important assets. And if you lose your voice, you can't create your podcast episode, and so that affects your podcast. Okay. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so what I mean by this is, let's say you get an advertiser and you start getting money for your podcast. You don't have to upgrade your equipment just because you get money for your podcast. All you really need to do, and this goes back to better equipment, focus on your content more. Maybe hire someone to do the editing, and that way you can focus more on content. Okay. Be consistent. I've discussed this before, but I think it's very important. Be consistent in your quality of your podcast and in your scheduling of the podcast. Be consistent. Okay. No one thing will increase the down. I don't know what that means. Oh, yeah. No one thing will increase your download numbers. So what I mean by this is you have to keep doing things consistently, and your download numbers will grow with that. If you get published, someone covers you in their magazine or something, that will increase your download numbers, but that's a one-time thing. It won't mean that you get 1 million subscribers immediately. So you have to keep being consistent, and your numbers will grow with consistency. Okay. The more you add to the podcast, the more that needs to be maintained. So the more software you add to the podcast, the more software that you have to make sure is updated. The more equipment you add, that means the more that needs to be maintained. You have to make sure it's clean, make sure there's no problems with the equipment, things like that. Okay. Don't eat sugar before you're recording. So I learned this the hard way, actually. When you eat sugar, it makes your voice sound weird. My voice doesn't sound like this right now. It sounds kind of low and different. So if you want to have consistency in your podcast, don't eat sugar before. Drink a lot of water. That's what I do. Okay. The average commute is 27 minutes. Okay. So a lot of people listen to podcasts in the car. And so what you want to do is you want to make sure that people are not messing with their phones while they're driving. And so by having a podcast that meets the average requirements for someone's commute, you make sure that they don't have to be looking at their phone while they're driving or on their commute. So yeah, you also have, never mind, I'll talk about that later. Okay. Editing is not necessary. So you don't have to edit a podcast. I kind of like how I kind of stumble and you hear that because it makes it more authentic. Other people do that as well. That's why you don't have to edit the podcast. I would say edit when you have a guest and they want something removed, or the sound quality is not as good, or like the content quality of the guest. Okay, you don't have to add, fireworks or clapping every time you say something. Yeah, you can just keep it raw and authentic. Okay. People listen on more than one speed. Okay. So you have to keep in mind that people listen to a podcast on 1.5x, 1.2x. So that affects how you sound. If you're talking so fast, then it'll sound a lot faster on 1.5x or 1.2x. So you don't really want to be talking too fast. So that gives people a chance to hear everything you're saying in a normal tone. Okay. Not everyone has to listen to your podcast. And so I was listening to Bill Burr on Joe Rogan, and he was saying that he doesn't care that not everyone likes his comedy or him. And that kind of made me think, it's like, you don't need everyone to like your podcast, because you don't need a big audience to make a living at podcasting. Or this goes into business as well, but whatever. This is about podcasting. So, you can have 1 million people listen to your podcast, and that will support you. 1 million people is a very small percentage of the amount of people in the world. And you don't even need 1 million people. You can do it with 100,000 people supporting yourself through the podcast. Yeah. So, not everyone has to like your podcast. Choose your audience and stick with that audience. Grow your audience through that niche of people, and you'll be okay. Okay. People search for podcasts using their preferred search function on their preferred app. Okay, so what this means and why I'm bringing this up is because a lot of people will find your podcast if you title your podcast episodes well. So let's say I'm looking for how to make money podcasting. So I will type in how to make money, and then my podcast could come up. If you name your podcast episode something like make money and something else on the internet, your podcast title will be less likely to come up, and people will not find your podcast organically. Okay. All right. Swearing. So, the first thing I want to say about swearing in general is that when you have that tag that says your podcast is explicit, that is not inclusive, because kids can't listen to your podcast. And so that's one reason why I don't swear on the podcast, because I have younger family members, and I will have to hear about it if those kids in my family hear me swearing, and I just don't want to hear about it. Okay. The next reason and why everyone, I think, should not swear on their podcast is because I heard that in other countries, when a podcast episode is tagged explicit, those countries will hide your episode in your RSS feed from the citizens of that country. So you're getting less downloads from specific countries when you have your episode tagged as explicit. Okay. And then if you have every episode tagged as explicit, then people in those countries can't listen to your podcast at all. Okay. Next thing, the penultimate one. Okay. Listeners don't care about your download numbers. Don't bother sharing your download numbers with your listeners. They don't care how many other people are listening to your podcast. They might care if their friends listen to your podcast, and if they want their friends to listen to your podcast, they will share the podcast with their friends. And no one cares about if your podcast has 10,000 listeners if they're already listening to the podcast. So don't bother sharing download numbers with listeners. Okay. And the final thing, make your podcast easy to find. Allowing people to organically search your podcast makes it easier for people to find your podcast, which is less work for you, because people find your podcast without you having to promote. your podcast. Okay, and that brings dividends to you. Okay, that's all I have for now. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day.